In the summer of 1961, a young Soviet engineer named Vladimir Sherbitsky stood before a panel of Communist Party officials in Moscow, explaining why he had been detained at the Polish border. His crime was not espionage, not smuggling weapons, not distributing anti-Soviet literature. He had attempted to bring back 3 pairs of American-made Levi's jeans. The interrogation lasted 4 hours. His party membership was suspended. He lost his position at the Ministry of Heavy Industry, all for denim trousers. This was not an isolated incident. It was emblematic of a vast ideological struggle that would define Soviet cultural policy for 3 decades. A battle in which clothing became weaponized, fashion became subversion, and a simple garment transformed into a symbol powerful enough to threaten the foundations of communist ideology itself. To understand why jeans became contraband in the Soviet Union requires understanding the fundamental tension at the heart of Soviet society after World War II. The USSR had emerged victorious, but devastated. 27 million dead. Entire cities reduced to rubble. The industrial heartland scorched by years of total war. Yet Stalin and his successor promised the Soviet people that their system would not merely rebuild, but would surpass the capitalist West in every measurable way. This was the essence of Khrushchev's famous 1959 declaration that the Soviet Union would overtake America in per capita production within 20 years. The competition was existential. Every comparison became ideological. Every consumer good became a referendum on which system better served humanity. The problem was that by the late 1950s, American cultural products were seeping through the Iron Curtain with increasing frequency. The 1957 World Festival of Youth and Students in Moscow brought 34,000 foreign visitors to the Soviet capital. Among them were thousands of Western students wearing jeans, leather jackets, and carrying jazz records. Soviet youth saw something their official culture could not provide: casual elegance, individual expression, and the aura of freedom. The American denim trouser, originally workwear for California gold miners and cowboys, had been transformed by Hollywood and Madison Avenue into something far more dangerous than mere clothing. It had become a symbol of rebellion, youth, and Western individualism. The Soviet leadership recognized the threat immediately. In 1958, the Komsomol Central Committee issued Internal Directive No. 47, which identified Western fashion as a vector for ideological contamination. The document, declassified in 1991, explicitly named jeans as particularly problematic because they represented the aesthetic of American capitalism and the cult of mindless consumption. The reasoning was more sophisticated than simple xenophobia. Soviet ideology required that citizens find their identity through collective participation in building communism, not through individual consumer choices. Fashion, by its very nature, was about personal expression and differentiation. It elevated the individual above the collective. Worse still, it created desire for foreign goods, implicitly acknowledging that Soviet industry could not satisfy its own citizens' wants. The campaign against jeans intensified throughout the early 1960s. In 1961, the same year Vladimir Sherbitsky faced his interrogation. The Ministry of Culture published guidelines for appropriate socialist dress. Men were encouraged to wear simple suits in gray or brown. Women should favor modest dresses and sensible shoes. The guidelines specifically prohibited narrow trousers in the Western style and clothing that imitates capitalist fashion trends. Universities established dress codes. Students appearing in jeans could be expelled. The Leningrad Polytechnic Institute dismissed 17 students in 1962 alone for dress code violations. Factory committees held meetings to criticize workers who wore Western-style clothing. The pressure was comprehensive and unrelenting. But prohibition created desire. The Soviet black market for jeans exploded precisely because they were forbidden. A pair of authentic American Levi's could sell for 150 rubles on the Moscow black market in 1962, equivalent to a month's salary for an average worker. Wranglers commanded similar prices. Even inferior European knockoffs from Poland or Yugoslavia could fetch 50 rubles. The economics were irresistible for those with access to foreign goods. Sailors on merchant vessels traveling to Western ports became crucial smuggling conduits. A seaman could purchase jeans in Hamburg or Rotterdam for $10 and sell them in Leningrad for 10 times that amount. The risks were substantial. Customs inspections were thorough. Penalties included confiscation, fines, loss of employment, and even criminal charges for large-scale smuggling. The KGB took the denim trade seriously because it represented more than economic crime. It was ideological subversion. Internal KGB documents from 1964 describe organized networks moving Western goods through Soviet ports. One operation in Odessa involved 43 sailors and 12 customs officials who had been bribed to ignore contraband. When the network was broken up in March 1964, authorities seized over 800 pairs of jeans, 300 leather jackets, and countless other Western items. The sailors received sentences ranging from 3 to 7 years in labor camps. The customs officials faced longer terms for betraying their positions of trust. The message was clear. Trafficking in Western culture was tantamount to treason. Yet the demand only grew. The reason was generational. Young Soviets born after World War II had no memory of the Great Patriotic War's sacrifices. They had grown up in relative stability under Khrushchev's thaw, a period of modest liberalization when some Western culture was permitted. They had heard Willis Conover's Voice of America jazz broadcasts. They had seen photographs in smuggled magazines. They knew that beyond the Iron Curtain existed a world of color, style, and individual expression that Soviet ideology denied them. Jeans became the physical manifestation of that forbidden world. Wearing them was an act of quiet rebellion, a way of asserting individual identity against the crushing conformity of Soviet life. The Soviet fashion industry attempted to respond. In 1964, the Moscow Textile Institute developed a Soviet jean alternative called verevka, meaning rope, a reference to denim's durability. The design was approved by the Ministry of Light Industry and put into production at factories in Leningrad and Kiev. But verevka jeans were disasters. The denim was stiff and uncomfortable. The cut was unflattering. The rivets fell off. The indigo dye ran, staining everything it touched. Most damning, they looked nothing like real American jeans. Soviet youth rejected them immediately. The verevka line was discontinued in 1967, after selling less than 30% of manufactured units. The failure revealed a fundamental truth. Soviet central planning could build nuclear weapons and launch satellites, but it could not create desirable consumer goods. The situation grew more complex after the 1968 Prague Spring, when Soviet tanks crushed Czechoslovakia's experiment with socialism with a human face. Disillusionment spread throughout the Eastern Bloc. Young people increasingly turned to Western culture as a form of passive resistance. In the Soviet Union, the Stylyagi subculture, which had existed since the 1950s, evolved into a broader movement of youth who rejected official Soviet aesthetics. They wore jeans, grew their hair long, listened to rock music, and cultivated an apolitical stance that was itself political in its refusal to engage with communist ideology. The authorities responded with increased repression. In 1969, Komsomol brigades began patrolling Moscow streets, stopping young people wearing Western clothing. They would cut long hair with scissors, tear Western band patches off jackets, and publicly shame those dressed in unapproved fashion. The economic absurdity reached its peak in the early 1970s. A genuine pair of Levi's 501s could cost 200 rubles by 1973, while the average monthly wage was 130 rubles. People saved for months to buy smuggled jeans. Some sold family heirlooms. Others traded goods and services in elaborate barter chains. A thriving rental market emerged where someone might rent authentic American jeans for a special occasion, paying 20 rubles for a weekend. Entrepreneurs purchased jeans in bulk from Western tourists at hotels frequented by foreigners, paying in rubles at inflated rates but still making enormous profits on resale. The Hotel Intourist in Moscow and the Astoria in Leningrad became notorious for these transactions. Western tourists quickly learned that their jeans were valuable currency in the Soviet Union. Guidebooks published in the West advised travelers that they could sell their worn jeans for more than they originally paid for them. Some tourists brought extra pairs specifically to sell. The practice became so common that Soviet customs began confiscating jeans from departing tourists, claiming they were attempting to illegally export Soviet currency, though the actual goal was to reduce the supply of authentic Western denim. In 1974, customs at Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport seized over 2,000 pairs of jeans from tourists. The confiscated items were supposed to be destroyed, but many ended up on the black market, sold by the same customs officials who had seized them. The 1975 Helsinki Accords, which committed the Soviet Union to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, had an unexpected impact on the jeans question. Soviet citizens began citing the agreement's provisions on cultural exchange to argue that restricting Western clothing violated international commitments. The argument was legally tenuous but reflected growing boldness among Soviet youth. Dissidents like Andrei Amalrik noted in his writings that the battle over jeans represented a larger struggle over personal autonomy. If the state could dictate what citizens wore, it could control every aspect of their lives. Conversely, winning the right to wear what one chose was a small but meaningful victory for individual liberty. The Soviet leadership faced a dilemma. Harsh repression risked creating martyrs over something as seemingly trivial as trousers. But permitting jeans meant acknowledging that Soviet industry could not compete with Western consumer goods, undermining the entire premise of socialist superiority. The solution, implemented gradually from 1976 onward, was selective tolerance combined with renewed attempts at domestic production. Authorities stopped actively prosecuting people for wearing jeans, though official disapproval remained. Simultaneously, the Ministry of Light Industry launched another initiative to produce acceptable Soviet denim. This time, the effort was more serious. Soviet industrial planners studied captured American jeans, analyzing the weave, the dye, the stitching patterns. They purchased Western denim manufacturing equipment through intermediaries. In 1978, the Leningrad clothing factory No. 7 began producing Tver jeans, named after the nearby city. The quality was substantially better than Verevka. The denim was softer. The cut more closely approximated Western styles. But even Tver jeans could not match American originals. The dye was less vibrant. The fabric wore out faster. Most critically, they lacked the cultural cachet of genuine Levi's or Wranglers. Soviet youth could immediately distinguish real American jeans from Soviet imitations, and the distinction mattered enormously. The 1980 Moscow Olympics presented both opportunity and crisis. The Soviet government wanted to showcase socialism's achievements to the world, but they also needed to prevent ideological contamination from the influx of Western visitors. In preparation, authorities arrested hundreds of black market traders in Moscow and Leningrad in 1979. The crackdown was called Operation Clean City. Those convicted received harsh sentences intended to deter others. Simultaneously, stores selling goods for hard currency were stocked with Western items, including jeans, but only foreigners could shop there. Soviet citizens standing outside these Berezovka stores, looking at goods they could not legally purchase with their own currency, experienced the contradictions of their system in the most direct way possible. The Olympics brought 15,000 foreign visitors to Moscow. Despite the American-led boycott over Afghanistan, athletes and spectators from dozens of countries attended. They wore jeans everywhere. Soviet citizens saw that in the rest of the world, this garment their government had demonized for 2 decades was completely ordinary. The cognitive dissonance was profound. After the Olympics, the black market for jeans expanded rather than contracted. The authorities had lost the ideological battle even if they maintained the legal prohibitions. By the early 1980s, enforcement had become sporadic and half-hearted. Brezhnev's gerontocracy was focused on maintaining power and managing economic stagnation, not policing youth fashion. Jeans were still officially discouraged, but wearing them no longer carried serious consequences in most situations. The exception was for those in sensitive positions. Military personnel, government officials, teachers, and party members could still face sanctions for wearing Western clothing. But for ordinary citizens, especially in larger cities, jeans had become normalized through sheer persistence of demand. The final transformation came with Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost after 1985. As part of broader reforms, restrictions on Western consumer goods were relaxed. In 1986, the Soviet Union signed trade agreements with several Western companies, including Levi Strauss. The first official Levi's store in the Soviet Union opened in Moscow in 1988, 30 years after jeans had been declared ideologically dangerous. The line to enter stretched around the block. People waited for hours to purchase what had once been contraband. The prices were high by Soviet standards, but they were legal prices in rubles, not black market rates. The symbolism was overwhelming. The Soviet state had capitulated to denim. The story of jeans in the Soviet Union reveals the fundamental weakness of totalitarian systems attempting to control culture. The Soviet government could imprison dissidents, crush uprisings, and maintain nuclear parity with the United States, but it could not make its citizens stop wanting American jeans. The desire for these garments was not primarily about fashion. It was about freedom of choice, about individual expression, about access to a wider world beyond Soviet borders. Every pair of smuggled Levi's represented a tiny crack in the Iron Curtain, a small space where individual desire trumped state ideology. The economic dimensions were equally revealing. The black market for jeans demonstrated that Soviet central planning had failed to create consumer goods that people actually wanted. The enormous prices that jeans commanded showed the vast gap between official Soviet wages and the real value of Western products. The corruption involved in smuggling operations illustrated how the Soviet system bred cynicism and law-breaking even among those charged with enforcing rules. Customs officials, sailors, factory managers, and party members all participated in the illegal denim trade, each taking their cut, and thereby acknowledging that the system they served could not meet basic consumer demands. The generational aspect cannot be overlooked. The battle over jeans was fundamentally a struggle between an aging Soviet leadership clinging to ideological purity and a younger generation that had grown up in a world where the West was no longer an abstract enemy, but a visible alternative. These young Soviets had not experienced the revolution or the Great Patriotic War. They had no personal investment in the sacrifices that had built the Soviet Union. They wanted what young people everywhere wanted: to express themselves, to be individuals, to participate in global youth culture. Jeans were the most visible symbol of these desires, which is precisely why the authorities fought so hard against them. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, one of the most iconic images was of Russian youth wearing Levi's and drinking Coca-Cola in Red Square. Western journalists interpreted this as the triumph of capitalism over communism, and in a sense, it was. But it was also the culmination of a 30-year struggle by ordinary Soviet citizens to claim the right to choose their own clothing. The fall of the USSR had many causes: economic stagnation, military overextension, nationalist movements, leadership failures. But among them was the simple fact that the system could not satisfy its citizens' basic desire for consumer choice and individual expression. Today, jeans are ubiquitous in Russia and throughout the former Soviet Union. No one thinks twice about wearing them. But for those who lived through the Soviet era, especially those who risked punishment to obtain them, jeans retain a special significance. They remember when wearing the wrong trousers could cost you your job, your education, or your freedom. They remember a time when something as simple as denim became a battleground between individual desire and state control. The story of illegal jeans in the USSR is ultimately a story about the limits of authoritarian power. A government can control armies, economies, and institutions, but it cannot finally control what people want, what they dream of, or what they will risk to express their individual identity. The Soviet Union learned this lesson too late, and by the time they opened that first legal Levi's store in Moscow, the ideological battle was already lost. The jeans had won.